Bueno, buenos días a todos. Muchísimas gracias por estar acá con nosotros en este seminario de investigación del CITIC. Para nosotros es un placer contar hoy con la presencia del doctor Haahr, que es nuestro invitado especial por las siguientes 2 semanas. El doctor viene de la Universidad de Trinity en Dublin, Irlanda. Y entonces les voy a contar un poquito sobre él y luego ya van a poder tener el placer de escuchar un poquito sobre lo que nos va a contar. El doctor es profesor de la Universidad de Trinity College en Dublin, Irlanda, y él obtuvo su doctorado en Ciencias de la Computación en 2003 en esa misma institución. Ahí se desempeña actualmente como director del máster en medios digitales interactivos dentro de esa universidad. Y algo interesante de Dr. Haahr es que él tiene un background multidisciplinario. Entonces, él tiende puentes entre lo que es la ciencia y las artes y está considerado como un autor reconocido, un referente internacional en el área de narrativa digital interactiva y los juegos serios. Y también él ha explorado tecnologías como la realidad aumentada y la realidad virtual para la enseñanza de problemáticas complejas como la salud del cerebro y la interpretación del patrimonio cultural. También una faceta interesante que él tiene es que es emprendedor tecnológico y, por ejemplo, fue el creador en 1998 de random.org, que es el principal servicio de Internet en la generación de números aleatorios verdaderos. Y cuenta con una sólida trayectoria en comercialización de la investigación científica, habiendo fundado 2 compañías en Irlanda y fue galardonado por, en particular, una de ellas, que es Haunted Planet Studios, donde él desarrolla juegos de realidad aumentada. Y actualmente es el CEO y el director creativo de esta compañía. Entonces, sin más, le doy la palabra a Dr. Haahr. Thanks for coming and welcome to the University of Costa Rica. It's a pleasure for us to have you here, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. And thank you to all of you for coming today, and also sincere thanks to University of Costa Rica and to Professors Alexandra and Alberto for having me and facilitating this visit. So today I'll be talking about foundations of serious games and interactive digital narrative. And these are some things that are very close to my heart and that are informing my research now for many years. And as Alexandra mentioned, you know, I have, in addition to my academic work in the universities, I have 2 other projects I work on. One of them is the internet's sort of true random number service called random.org, which I've been running since 1998. Can you believe it? Probably a lot of you were not even alive in 1998 or born yet, but here we are. And the other one is Haunted Planet Studios, which is a serious game development company. So those are the other 2 activities, which I'll be using a little bit as examples, not so much random.org, but Haunted Planet, some of the work we're doing there, I will use as some of examples today, and also at the follow-up talk that we have tomorrow. So serious games, I'm sure you're all familiar with games, but what are serious games? So in my definition, serious games are basically games with another primary purpose than entertainment, because all the games that we normally play are, of course, fun and engaging and entertaining, and that's why we play them. But serious games are games that ideally are also fun and entertaining, but also have another primary purpose. And why do we use games for things that are not entertainment, right? And the answer, of course, is that games are engaging and that there are benefits to engaging someone or to being engaged. And those benefits can be for the player who's being engaged by the game activity, but it can also be a benefit for the developer or the producer of the game, or for both, as the case may be. So I'm going to start by basically showing a couple of examples of serious games that you might know of, and we will talk just very briefly about them before we do a deeper dive. So I don't know, has any of you, are you familiar with this one? Yeah, Duolingo, of course, right? So Duolingo is oops, what happened to my visuals here? Oh, they're back. Okay. Duolingo is, of course, a gamified language learning activity, right? So by gamified mean that it's at its core, I wouldn't consider Duolingo a game per se, but it's a learning activity that has had game elements added to it. So streaks and leaderboards and those types of things. So a lot of people are familiar with these. It's very successful, of course, commercially very successful, and their business model is free and paid tiered. So most people play it for free, but you can subscribe and get some extra features. And of course, they're also moving into certification. So if you're familiar with sort of language requirements that universities, for example, have, Duolingo now offers a certification feature that is accepted by many universities, including Trinity College. So it's competing with IELTS and TOEFL tests, which have for many years been the standard for universities, but Duolingo is moving in there. That's how it's monetized. And of course, as I said, they're very successful at this. Another example here, which is a historical example, is America's Army. I don't know if any of you have come across this game before. It's a very interesting example of a serious game. It's a first-person shooter, so it didn't have any specific learning objectives. Well, it does have a few, probably, in terms of familiarizing players with military sort of contexts, right? Also, it did not have a commercial purpose, right? So it was not intended, its primary purpose was not to make money. And in that way, it's a little bit of a departure from many other games. It was seen essentially intended as a recruitment tool, right? So for the US Army to recruit people to join the army in a way that was more cost effective for them, than the other means they had at the time. Also for public relations purposes, to help them shape their branding. And as I mentioned, military familiarization also. So very interesting example from the early 2000s for a game, for a serious game for many other purposes. Minecraft education, I don't know if you use that or if you come across that in the second level schools or primary schools, essentially a platform for classroom use. Their model is institutional licensing, so institutions have to pay a fee to Microsoft per person who's using it, per school. And of course, one of the benefits that Microsoft gets from this is also ecosystem integration, because you need a Microsoft account to play Minecraft education. And this is beneficial for Microsoft because people then are kind of connected to their ecosystem. Another example I took here is a system called Osso VR. I don't know if you come across it. It's very different from the other examples here. It's a surgical training platform for medical professionals. So very sort of serious simulation based that has some game-like activities. And their model is, of course, a software as a service, sort of a licensing model that they license to people who make medical equipment, and they to some hospitals and so on, also for training. So the idea is that you can operate in virtual reality on virtual humans rather than real humans, which is of course much cheaper, and so you can learn the basics there. So a little bit like a flight simulation for medical purposes. You could kind of maybe talk about it that way. So these are just some examples, right? Of course, there's many more, and these are examples that are, I would say, sort of successful by one measure or not. I also want to mention academic serious games, right? And there's a little bit of a sad truth here, because there are hundreds of academic, and I put it in quotation marks there, games that are designed and evaluated by academics, right? So as part of research projects. So serious games for learning typically that have been developed, but very few of these are continually successful or even still exist today. It's very hard for academics to keep these games to market or bring them to market and keep them running and keep them beneficial. The strengths of these types of games, and it's a different category really from the earlier ones we saw, is that they're often subject to evaluation. So they've been tested and evaluated in a rigorous manner. And there's evidence for the learning games. We know that they really work because we test the students before and after the game activity, and we can see, okay, they have learned such and such, of the learning objectives for the game. So this is the strength of these games, that many of them are tested rigorously, but the weaknesses are quite significant. Also, unfortunately, one of them is that academics are often not game designers. And this means that many of these resulting games, they lack the engagement that we talked about earlier on. They are not as fun or as interesting simply because the academics are not primarily game designers. We're professors, and so our skill set is not necessarily in game design. This is one of the challenges for this domain. Also, these games are subject to research funding cycles, right? So research funding works by you get a grant and it runs for 2, 3, 4, 5 years maximum, probably. And that means you can develop a game, design and develop and test a game within that time period. But then after that, you don't have any more funding, right? And then there's no funding to maintain the game afterwards, to bring it to market through sales, and to continue developing it. That is a challenge. It needs to get spun out of university as a separate entity, maybe through a startup company or something. But academics are often also not entrepreneurs. And it's difficult for academics to get products to market, and often it's not their core interests. They're professors, so they're interested in research, not necessarily in bringing things to market. So as you can see there's quite sort of a lot of weaknesses or challenges in relation to academic serious games. I want to talk a little bit about when games are most engaging, because we've kind of pinned this down now as a crucial part of the game activity. Games need to be engaging. They need to work to capture our imagination and our activity. We need to get immersed in them. And I think games are most engaging really when the player's skill matches the challenge they face. There's quite a lot of work to this that I just want to summarize very, very briefly. Are you familiar with the optimal experience and the flow theory by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi? No, a few people are shaking their heads, a few people are nodding. Okay. You probably know that a game is engaging if it's the right difficulty for you. Right? It's not too hard, it's not too easy. Right? And Professor Csikszentmihalyi captured this I think it was back in the 1970s, maybe even, when he was studying how people learn. So he was not a game scholar. He was a professor in learning and education. That was his field, and he defined what he called the optimal experience of learning. And the way he expressed it was as what he called the flow channel. So you can see in this graph here, which is from captures his idea, is on the x-axis we have the skill level of the learner. And on the y-axis, we have the challenge level of the activity that we give the learner. And what he observed was that if we have a good match between the skill level, the challenge that we give the learner and their skill level, and we increase the challenge sort of proportionally in a nice step up through the graph, then we get them into what he called the flow channel. So essentially a mental state that encourages us to learn more. It's very pleasant to be in the flow state because you're just on a roll. You feel, okay, I'm doing great here. It's getting a little bit more difficult. You could just manage to complete the challenge and so on. So a very pleasant state where learning happens very smoothly as you proceed up the flow channel and you're increasing your skill level. And you can see the flow channel here is shown with the white channel in the middle of the graph. Up here we have, if things are too hard, if we have the challenge that's too high and our skill level is too low, then we have anxiety and we quit often. If things are too easy, then we get bored. So that's essentially a very simple model that captures what Csikszentmihalyi called sort of the optimal experience. So my point here is games are really about learning. This also pertains to games, right? So, and my point here is that not just serious games are about learning, but actually all, or I crossed out all there because there are actually some interesting exceptions to this, but the vast majority of games are really about learning. That's what we do when we play games. We learn, right? What do we learn? We learn to play the game. We learn to beat other players. We learn to beat the levels. We learn to beat the opponents. We learn to figure out the system. How does this game work? How do I play this game well? That's what we're learning, right? And this can be aligned with other learning objectives or not, but that is essentially what we're learning. doable challenges, essentially, those that sit right in the flow channel, they allow us to progress, to learn, and to get better. And this puts us into this mental experience of flow, which is pleasant and where we're learning and we're doing really well. Game designers, if we apply this model to game design, then must design their gameplay and their mechanics, design their games to keep the players in this flow channel as much as possible. This is one school of thought in game design. And I'm going to bring in here Genova Chen, who's one of the people who at about 2007, 2008 started applying Csikszentmihalyi's learning theories for game design. And Genova Chen did it particularly nicely. So I'm going to use his graph. You see a little picture of him there. And he observed that different players, when we talk about games, have different flow zones. Right. So any of you are hardcore players? Anyone plays Dark Souls or any of those types of games? A few people? Okay, right. So you would belong in the hardcore spectrum here. You like a serious challenge, right? Okay. So some players like that, right? Some players, they're more in the Candy Crush, sort of experience. They're here in the novice, maybe we could call them novice. I'm not sure. This is Genova Chen's terminology. But some people who like a sort of a more gentle flow channel. They want their challenges to sort of go up, but not too fast, not too punishingly hard, right? So there are different flow channels that different players like. I recommend Genova Chen's writings of this also. So the observation here is that game designers, when we create games, we can adapt the player's flow experience through the choices that they make in order to build these choices into the experience. And Genova Chen depicts it like as this graph, essentially. If we're creating a game, we'll put in sort of points where the player either makes a choice explicitly, or we sort of deduce what kind of player they are, what kind of experience they like, and then we sort of take them this way or we take them that way, depending on what we think they'll like. Right, so this is something we can incorporate into our game design. I'll also just make a point about digital games versus analog games. So when I say analog games, I mean games like chess, or even football. In those types of games, we do not withhold information about the rules. There's no sort of system to figure out. The rules are clear and they're published, and they're normally not overly complicated, right? You can learn the rules to chess probably in 20 minutes, but it takes a lifetime to really master the game. In comparison, oh yes, I should say here, the question is, when you want to be good at chess or football, is what strategy can I develop that will use those rules that everyone knows to my advantage to make me play well, in this game. In comparison, digital games, the rules are rarely presented so clearly as in chess. You get basic instructions about what to do and how to play, but most of the rules only become apparent through exploration, right? So you figure out things, you realize, oh, something happens in this game, I now need to do something else. I need to adapt my strategy, essentially, in order to play well. So you literally learn the game, again, coming back to our earlier point, by playing, right? You play the game and you figure out how it works. And James Paul Gee, who's also a learning scholar, has described this in this sequence here I have on the slide. So he says, first, the player must probe the virtual world, the game world, and this involves looking around the current environment, clicking on things, and engaging in certain game activities. Then the next step that happens is, based on this reflection, the player forms a hypothesis about some activity or a text or an object or artifact or event or an action might mean in a usefully situated way. So the players essentially, I wonder what happens if I do this, if I click on this, if I move this object in the game world over here, what happens? Then the next step is the player then reprobes the world with that hypothesis in mind. They try out what they had in mind and see, what does it do? What effect do we get in the game world when we try this? And then the player treats this effect as feedback from the world and then accepts or rethinks his or her original hypothesis. And then the loop starts all over again. And you can draw it like this. So we have probe, hypothesize, reprobe, and rethink, essentially. So we have this loop. This is how players interact with the game world. Does this remind you of anything? Have you seen this type of loop before? Yes? No? It's the scientific method. This is how we test hypotheses, of course. It's even in the vocabulary there. And this is something that we can use when we design games. This type of knowledge is for serious game. So I'd like to talk a little bit about serious game development before we get into some more specific examples. There's a bunch of different models defined for serious game development, sort of frameworks that can guide the development of the games. The one I'm going to be using here is by your very own Professor Alberto, and it's called the CLG framework, Anastasia. And it's a very nice model. It's very clear, easy to understand, and it captures, I think, pretty much everything you need to do when designing a serious games. So CLG stands for context, learning, and game. And essentially, you start with the context, right? So when you want to say, we need to create a new serious game, let's say a game for learning something, then we need to take into account the educational environment. Where is it set? What kind of, is it a school or is it a university? What is the target audience? So age group, and what are they trying to learn? Facilities and equipment, what's available? Will it run on smartphones, iPads, or will it run on PCs in labs, or will people play it from home? Does it need network? All these types of things. And the budget, of course, how much money is available for the development. So that other things included in context as well, but these are some of the important ones. Then there's a question of learning considerations, right? Which learning theory we'll use. We won't have time to go into detail about learning theories today, but there's a lot of work done on that. Specifically in learning objectives, what do we want the player to learn from playing this game specifically, right? Then learning activities, what activities are useful for this, and then how do we assess if they learned or not, right? So those are learning aspects. And then, of course, the game, which includes the game design, the development, and the testing of the game, finding bugs, but also testing whether it works or not. So the idea is that you start with the context, then you build the learning, and then you finally build the game right on the top. So there's a lot to do before you get to actually coding the game. You don't sit down just and start programming. And this is also an iterative process. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, but through some examples to make it a little more practical, because it is an abstract model and it's a theoretical contribution. But before we do that, I'm going to start talk a little bit about interactive digital narrative or interactive storytelling. How many of you are familiar with interactive storytelling? A few. Okay, that's good. Okay, so you might be familiar with some of this already. But for the rest of you, I'm just going to give you a very quick, basic introduction to some of the key ideas in interactive digital narrative. First of all, I'd like to really zoom out and talk about why a story is important, right? And I think the way stories are important to us as humans for many reasons, but primarily because they are the way in which we as individuals make sense of the world around us and even of ourselves, right? We think through stories. Our brains are basically hardwired for stories. And stories can be our own personal stories. How successful am I in my life? What am I going through? What are the challenges I'm facing? How am I dealing with them? Those are very personal stories. And our brains are wired to tell those stories to ourselves, and that they can be good if you feel you're successful in your life, but it can also be bad if you feel you're a failure. And there's sort of a lot of psychologist attention, focused on how do we deal with these stories if they're not conducive to or not productive for us, right? So they can be our own personal stories. Stories can have incredible emotional effect. We can use stories to share our joys as well as sorrows. So they're extremely important for humans. But they can also be large stories. They're not just individual personal stories. They can be large stories, and they can be about a whole people or a whole civilization. And they can have tremendous political power also, and they can mobilize and they can inspire people in ways. So stories are really powerful, and they're very important for us. They're also the vehicle through which we can release our own unique viewpoint, our experience of our lives. We can release that and allow others to look through our eyes by sharing our stories. So I have an example of an individual story here, not an interactive story. As you can see, this is from a project called Humans of New York, which has gone global, and it's a very personal story. So the tumor had a very complicated name. At first, they told us 3 to 5 years and that it wouldn't be painful. We tried to keep living. We tried not to think about what could happen and just function as normally as possible. It wasn't so bad when we were together, but the alone moments were wrenching when we were falling asleep or waking up. On the other hand, it's dark and silent and you feel calm, but there's always this gaping hole of fear in front of you. During the day, you can cover it up, you can get busy and focus on your work and think about other, and so on and so on. So this is, of course, a story about cancer, about illness, right? And probably a lot of us will have been touched in our families by cancer and so on. But by sharing these stories, we can share our experiences and get empathy for each other and understand and feel that we are in the same boat, really, as humans, and we can release our individual stories here. So this is an example of a story that's very personal and individual, challenge related to an individual couple, but there are also stories on a grander scale. So here's one, for example. I'm going to play just a little snippet of this one. You might know this story already.
That one day, this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We always choose to be self-evident that all men are created equal. That one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one day, even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, I have a dream.
Oops, sorry. Sorry, it's quite long, but you get the idea. What is this story about? He's telling a story, right? He's a very engaging speaker. What is it? What is the story about? Racism and oppression. Definitely correct. What is it also about? Freedom. It's about freedom and about brotherhood, right? Equality, freedom and brotherhood. Right? This is what he's focusing on. And he's a very captivating speaker in this. And this is, of course, one of the iconic speeches of the 20th century. I probably have come across it before, but it's summarized. We know it as I have the dream speak, but it's a story and it's quite long, but it's a story about these things that we discussed there. There's, of course, other stories too. Here's one that I'm sure we're all familiar with these days. Make America Great Again, right? This is a story, a restoration story. You know, it is a story that tries to say America used to be great, it's not anymore, and we need to do something about it. That's really to boil it down. Another story. Also, I'm using these because we all know them and you probably know them as much as we do in Europe here. Yes, we can. Do you remember this one? This was Barack Obama's logo. This is a story about what? It's not a restoration story. It's not we've lost something and we want to get it back, right? This is a story about ability. Things are possible, right? We can change things for the better. We can elect a black president, maybe also. So all of these stories are, the political stories, the great political stories here, as we've seen, are, of course, summarizable into just a few words. And that makes them extra powerful because someone who hears this story, they can impose their own interpretation of the story on them, which is useful from a political point of view, but maybe also dangerous a little bit. Stories are, of course, told in many different ways, right? Back to cave paintings and to stories shared around the fireplace, maybe after a hunting party, sort of to classic drama, going back maybe to ancient Greece and so on. novels, which have existed, I guess, for a few centuries at least, and radio plays, films, and so on that were very popular in the 20th century. And what we are using today, which is something I have listed here, comic books, TV series, sort of Netflix style, but also games, of course, right? Which is where I wanted to get with this. My apologies if it was a bit long. This was what I wanted to get to. Games are, of course, interactive stories, right? So there's a question there, and this is what we're talking about today, interactive digital narrative. How are stories made interactive? Any ideas? Including the what?
The audience.
The audience, yes. Yes, the audience. We need to include the audience. What does the audience do? They choose, right? What makes a story interactive? Those earlier ones we looked at, cave paintings, they're not terribly interactive, right? Something happens in your brain when you look at them, but you don't interact with the cave painting unless you go and modify it, maybe add some new elements. Choice is really crucial in interactive storytelling. Whether the choice is explicit or not, there's always a choice there. We can map those choices using this type of graph. I don't know if you've come across this type of graph before in computer science. I know probably a lot of you are computer scientists. We call them trees, of course, and a special class of graphs, right? We have the root of the tree here, and then the branches, and then we end and when here on the right side. And we can see here's a graph of some story, and essentially we start here, and then we're confronted with a choice. We make a choice that branches in one or two directions. We choose again, and then we end in some endings that have a success and some endings that are failure. So this is how we draw those stories. At each point is a choice, right? The player chooses something, whether they know it or not. This comes back to these books. I don't know if are you familiar with Choose Your Own Adventure books? Yeah, good. If you're not, I actually brought one, right? So I'm going to pass it around. You can have a look. They were very popular in the 1970s and 1980s. And those ideas that were developed at this time are really still in use today. They're still very important. And they're used in game design also. Here is a map of the book that I just passed around, right? So when you read these books, you don't read the book from cover to cover in case you haven't come across one. You start on page 1, and then at the end of page 1, it'll say, oh, you're standing outside a house. Do you want to knock on the front door, or do you want to go into the basement and knock and see if the basement door is open? If you want to knock on the door, you go to page 2. If you want to see if the basement is open, you go to page 46. So you read the book by hopping around, depending on what you choose at the end of every page. And you can map this out, map this book, right? This is The Mystery of Chimney Rock by Edward Packard. We start at page 1, then there's page 2, page 3. On page 3, there's a choice, and we can go left or we can go right. And you can see the story is quite different. On the left, we have a lot of different passages. It's annotated. I don't know if you can read it from here, but here's a note where we narrowly escape a cave-in. Here is one where a house vanishes. Here is some point where we get rich. Our cousin gets rich. Over here, we get eaten by a cat. Over here, we get pneumonia. Over here, Jane disappears. Right. So you can see wildly different things can happen in this book, depending on what we choose. Right. And of course, if we read the book again and we make different choices, different things happen. Right. So, so this is how we structure interactive digital narratives through this tree structure with choices that create branches. There's many, I won't have time to talk about this today, but we'll talk about this at one of the workshops we have later on in the programs. There's many different ways these can be structured. This structure is called a time cave structure, but there's many others, and they're useful for different purposes. You might be familiar with Bandersnatch from Netflix. It's an interactive movie, so not exactly a game, but it's an interactive film where you make choices and you get a certain number of seconds, the timer runs down, to make your choice. We can also draw a map of Bandersnatch. How many of you have played Bandersnatch? Just a few. Okay, it's worth a try if you have a Netflix subscription or know someone who has one. But this is an interactive story. It's not a serious game, but it is an interesting piece of media because it also reflects a lot on choice in its own regard. Oh, this is very bright. I don't know if you can see this, but this is essentially the structure of Bandersnatch I got from the IGN website. It's very differently structured from the book. We start up here and then we run all the way down and then we loop up here and we run all the way down and then we loop up here. So it's a much longer structure. It's not wide in the same way that we saw the earlier tree. It's more like one long line. So a very different way to structure our interactive story. We saw in Netflix that the choice was explicit. We had two choices, right? Many games, that are not not serious games, structure those choices explicitly too. You might have come across some of these types of stories here, where you choose one of three choices. Even in games like Elden Ring and Baldur's Gate that I've shown here, there's story-heavy games, and you navigate the story space by choosing, right? You don't have this explicit menu-based structure that we saw on the previous few slides and in Bandersnatch, or even in the Choose Your Own Adventure book. But we're still making choices about how do we approach this quest? Which quest do we solve first? How do we deal with the villain? Do we let him go or let him live? So all of these choices, they affect the story. Okay, good. Any questions about interactive digital narrative? That was a really very quick introduction here. Okay, any questions? Okay, good. So I'd like to talk now about a couple of examples of serious games that I've been involved in and that I know very well. The first one is about soft skills learning. So it's a game that is at the same time a serious game, but it's also an interactive digital narrative. So we're doing both with this game. And it was essentially, it's called Gaming for Peace Kusam, and it was it was funded by the European Union under the Horizon 2020 program. It was quite a big project. We had 15 different partners. You see Haunted Planet here. We were the game developers. Trinity College were involved through sociology and psychology. And you see a lot of other universities and small companies essentially in this space. You can still download the game here. I have a QR code for it later if you want to. It's free to play. It's just available for people to try. Essentially the purpose was to educate peacekeepers in soft skills. What are soft skills? So I took this from the Oxford Dictionary. Basically, personal qualities that enable you to communicate well with other people. Very useful skills, not something we tend to teach, explicitly in many contexts. But they are qualities that can be learned. We might think of them, oh, this person is great with other people, but these can be learned also. So our purpose in this project was to help peacekeepers learn soft skills. This is not something you generally learn as a peacekeeper. As a peacekeeper, I should know, just in case that you're not aware, if you want to become a peacekeeper, typically someone who is in that position, they already have education either as military, they might be education as a soldier, they might be police officer, they might be NGO, and in addition, to become a peacekeeper, they have to take an extra education on top of that. So those are the typical paths. So that was what we were trying to do. I'll talk more about this. So our context, to come back to the CLG model, our context was to train novice peacekeepers, so people who were already soldiers or police or NGO, to help them learn soft skills, often in a workshop format. This is part of our context. This was not necessarily a game experience that they would sit and do on their own. They might be with a trainer, they might be with a group, they might have a context to reflect on their results and their performance in the game. We also had limited capability digital hardware. So a lot of these might have been, done on a site in a deployment, in a country somewhere where they were stationed. The hardware might not be sophisticated. There probably wouldn't be fancy graphics cards. and often no network or very poor quality network. So this was our context, Then our learning, we focused on specific soft skills, right? So there's a lot of sort of a whole map of soft skills, which I won't go into today, but we focused on communication skills, cultural awareness, and gender awareness. Those were the ones that our domain experts decided these are the most important ones, really, to focus on them. And then the exact learning objectives, which were very specific learning objectives, and the player choices in our game, what can the player do? They were derived from workshops with end users and experts. So we had some very experienced peacekeepers, people who had been deployed for 20, 25 years, and they were our experts, and we put them in workshops and they helped us arrive to these learning objectives and activities. And then also we had assessment through a post-game portal, which I'll show you a screenshot of. So this was our learning aspect, if we put it within the CLG framework. I should mention the CLG framework didn't exist when we did this project, so I'm sort of reversed engineered it a little bit, but it's a nice model. It fits well on the work. And our game, we decided to make a visual novel game where the game story and characters were based on 150 interviews with experienced peacekeepers. So our project partners had done all these interviews and they were anonymized, and we essentially wrote stories based on their experience. They told us their best stories, and we sort of fictionalized them and turned them into the game. And the game looks like this. So there's two parts to the game. In the first half, you play Maria here that you see on the left. Maria is being deployed as a peacekeeper in Kusam, which is our fictionalized version of Lebanon. She has to sort of learn the ropes of peacekeeping. So she's our main character in the first part of the game. In the second part of the game, you play Adam, who's a Portuguese police officer who's mentoring a more junior colleague. So Adam is Portuguese, as I mentioned, and Maria here is from Finland. So these deployments are always very multicultural. You can see there's some Indian soldiers there also. And we use this structure that you saw before, 3 choices, and you choose what to do. And one of the tasks we had when we designed this game was to come up with the right 3 choices, right? And there were many considerations, but basically what we did was we had one that was a really good choice, and then we had 2 choices, one that was a middle choice and one that was not so good. But we always had to be careful that the not so good choice was not too obvious, right? It still had to be something that someone might do in this situation. So otherwise it would be too easy, and you wouldn't learn very much. You wouldn't make any mistakes. Not all the choices are equally significant. So this one is less significant than some of the other ones. And then at the end, we have your assessment. So when you finish the game, it takes maybe a couple of hours to play if you're focusing. Then you see your scores over time. You don't see the score until the end. You don't get immediate feedback other than what happens in the game story. So you see here we scored 4 stars out of 5 on gender awareness, 3 on cultural awareness, and 3 on communication. So we could have done a little bit better in this playthrough. And here's a summary of our choices and a little sort of few notes on what could have been better. So this is the post-game assessment portal. So this is part of our learning also. Here, I'm just going to show you to make it a little bit more tangible. Here's one of the difficult choices. Right, maybe more difficult choices. So here, we're playing Adam here on the left. We're mentoring our more junior colleague, Farah, who's basically just joined. She's police, and she's learning to join. We are investigating a crime. The woman here in the shadow, she's our translator. So she's a local, but she speaks the languages. We are now here in the office of a mayor in Kusam, in our fictionalized Lebanon, and we're investigating a crime. The police have discovered and shut down a brothel in the area, and the challenge we now have is to figure out who was operating this brothel. So we're in the mayor's office trying to gather information, but the mayor is uncomfortable with Farah as a female police officer investigating this kind of crime, right? So we have to navigate the space between the cultural awareness, respecting the local traditions, and the gender awareness, which is respecting Farah's right to do her job. right? So here is some of the options we have. We can say here, Farah is saying, I imagine he doesn't like what's happening under our noses. I'm sure it's nothing, maybe as some information for us. No, why would we be in trouble? And this is the answers to, do you think we are in trouble, essentially. So there's multiple steps in this. I'm not going to show you all of them. Here's the mayor, and here Adam here is saying, whatever you can say to me, you can say to Farah. We are both police officers. So here we are choosing as Adam to back up Farah and support her in her right to do her job. But you could have taken other path through the stories and your score would have been different. So these are some challenging ones. We can map out this game also using a map. Contrast is a little bit hard to read here, but essentially it's similar to those maps I showed you earlier. You know, this is in a model in a tool called Twine. Has anyone come across Twine before? Okay, we'll use that in one of our workshops. It's a very easy tool to use, and it's used in the games industry. We used it here in Haunted Planet for this game. So this game was deployed. It reached a good level of technology readiness level. This is a metric that the European Union uses, and I think it came from NASA possibly originally. Basically, the technology is validated in a relevant environment. It's very mature, it doesn't crash, and it's been deployed with the European Security and Defense Council and used across the world to train novice peacekeepers. So we're very happy with this result. This is a game that was used and had a real impact. And it's used in this workshop context that I mentioned. People don't normally play it on their own, but they play in a workshop format. If you'd like to play it, here's a QR code. You can also just go to the website in the corner there, gap-project.eu. It runs on iOS and on Mac and on Windows. And as I said, it takes about 2 hours to play, maybe a little bit more, depending on how much you agonize over the different choices. And then at the end, you can see how you did. So there's a lot more to say about this game. I won't have time to talk about this today. But we spent a lot of time on getting the details right, because one of the interesting challenges we had here was that the peacekeepers have an incredible attention to detail. So, for example, military insignia, are really important, right? If we had in our graphics, if we had the insignia a little bit wrong or on the wrong arm, then the peacekeepers would immediately lose confidence in the game. They would say they don't know what they're talking about. It's like, and the game would be discredited as a learning activity from those tiny details. That was very interesting for us to go through this. So we checked and double checked all the little detail, and we had our experts basically review our graphics and our dialogue and so on. So very interesting from that point of view. The second case study I want to talk about is intergenerational bonding. So this is a very different game, also through Haunted Planet Studios, and it's documented in this paper called Alice Daly, Augmented Reality, Evaluating a Cultural Outdoors Game for Intergenerational Play. There's a QR code, it's open access, so you can download it from the Elsevier website. There's a collaboration between myself and Svetlana Rudenko, who's one of my team members, and Kelly Jakubowski from Durham University in the UK. So going back here to I got the animations out of order here. Our context was basically here. We have an outdoors context. We have an area, maybe a forest or a park, or a garden, like a botanic garden. We have a family or an individual, and we have a standard smartphone. This is our context. And what we're trying to do is basically a little bit broader than what we were trying to do with the earlier game, with the Gaming for Peace game. We're trying to create cultural engagement with art, music, and literature. So basically appreciation and understanding and engagement with art and music and literature. We're also trying to create intergenerational bonding. I'll talk a little bit more about what that is exactly later on. But basically try and create bonds across generations between children and their parents or children and their grandparents and so on. Also, we were interested in healthy walking habits. we were not interested in having a formal assessment, right? So we were not trying to give you a certificate after the activity to say, oh, you have received intergenerational bonding level 5. You know, we didn't want to go that route, right? So instead, we had our study to measure was it effective or not, but we didn't have a score at the end to say, you know, how well you did. Well, there's a collection mechanic, which I'll show you all shortly, but the game is essentially a locative augmented reality game, so augmented reality AR for Android and iOS. It's based on literature, so specifically we used Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. I'm assuming everyone is familiar with the first Alice book. And then art. So Salvador Dali, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but he illustrated Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, the first book. So he made one painting for each chapter. So and then we had music, so original compositions on Dali's paintings by Svetlana Rudenko that I mentioned earlier. And then it was staged outdoors, either in curated locations where we have chosen the exact locations where you encounter the different chapters, or it can stage itself randomly also. So those are essentially our CLG aspects here. Has anyone played Pokemon Go? Okay, that's a locative augmented reality game, but it's very different from what we're doing, but it is still some similarities. Let me see here. Good. Okay. So here are just they're a little bit small, but essentially they're from the 1969 edition of Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Random House at that time published an anniversary edition of the book with Salvador Dali's drawings. They commissioned Salvador Dali to make these drawings. And Dali was very inspired by the Alice stories and so on. So he was very happy to do this. He didn't illustrate the second Alice book, unfortunately, but that's a different story. It's now staged and on permanent exhibition at Durham University. They have a beautiful little botanic garden there where the game is installed, but you can also play it in random mode. So if you want to try it here, that is also possible. I'm just going to show you a quick video. I'm just conscious, I think my audio is a little bit not going to the right channel. So I'm just going to see if I can get this fixed. Oh yeah, here. Okay. Okay, I think this should work. Okay. So yeah,
art sculptures. So it was only logical thing to invent the garden with new experiences of music and art of living. So we've been running a research study in the Botanic Gardens with undergraduate school children and their carers, looking at how playing with apps together can increase intergenerational cultural engagement and social engagement. We found that it was really good for getting kids and their carers to work together and cooperate. So kids were able to really take a leading role in trying to find an artwork around the garden. So they really like to kind of treasure an aspect of it. Art and music is a beautiful expression in a cultural form, in a language that we all understand, sometimes difficult to describe. In this augmented reality experiences, I wanted people to perceive the feelings of art and to understand the meaning of musical terms.
Excellent range, tremendous, fun, great and helpful. I think it's very creative and it's very nice sounding and it's very peaceful and calm. So it's great if you're just wanting a nice peaceful walk. So I think augmented reality and digital technologies more generally are really important for engaging people with VR. Because it makes art much more accessible to lots of people who, for instance, might never have been to an art gallery or to a classical concert before. All you need is a mobile phone in order to get a certain taste of what these experiences are like. want me to come recommend it, but I will definitely tell her about it. It's great.
Okay, I promise we didn't bribe those kids. This was what they actually said. So I'd like to talk just a little bit about the social studies on intergenerational play, because this was something that informed our thinking. So we're reading up on this, and we learned that the grandchild-grandparent relationship is believed to be a very important relationship because the grandchildren often receive support and guidance, but also the grandparents often find meaning and pride in the opportunities for caring and mentoring. So it's quite an important relationship for both parties in this type. There's also evidence that families that play together, it's important of games in families, or there's studies, especially on board games and so on also, that this is a good bonding activity for families to have and to experience together. Role switching, which we saw between the generations, I'll talk a little bit more about that, is found to be therapeutic. So the children here have a chance to take leading roles in the digital experiences because kids just understand digital games just like that, you know, whereas maybe if you have kids, you'll know this, right? Or if you're young, you might remember being frustrated with your parent because they didn't understand what you were doing. But parents are normally in control. But we found that this role switching, where the child could help the parent understand what was going on and how to play the game, this role switching is very healthy also for both parties. And this is something that's research on also that we didn't do ourselves, but this was part of our research context for this work. So the children basically help and educate the grandparents about digital experiences. This is one of the arguments, but while the grandparents can provide additional moral support and also cultural context, because we were working with classical music. You heard some of the music and the stories, of course, the Alice stories and Salvador Dali's artwork also. This is something that grandparents are likely to be more knowledgeable about, and they can share with the children. Let me see here. So I'll just like to show you the gameplay. You probably saw a little bit in the video already. The game is not complicated. This is our main screen. We have a radar here on the left. We have a map mode up here, and we have an augmented reality view. And then in the middle over there, we have the casebook where you review your play log, essentially. So that's good. Maybe I'll just pause it for a second. So here we're in the radar mode, and this is the mode that with the map mode, which I haven't shown you here yet. This is how you find the encounters. So there's an encounter for each chapter, and you meet some other characters that are mentioned in that chapter of the book. So here we can see, this is like a naval radar, like a ship's radar. And we can see we're quite close to this encounter. And as a result, these LEDs have lit up and we can interact with it. And this button here is glowing, so we can see, oh yeah, we can now see this encounter, and we hear the sound and so on. So the first thing you have to do is getting closer to encounter such that you can hear it, see it, and hear it. So you see the painting floating in the air, and then you can take the photo. So you see, after we took the photo, it went into our casebook, which is essentially our play log. And when we've taken the photo, we unlock a little bit more information about the photo. You know, it tells us which chapter is it, and we could probably hear from the audience. You might recognize the narrator. Essentially, this is your play log. And that's the play loop. Once you've taken the photo, you go back to the radar to find the next encounter. So it's not a terribly complicated game. You know, it's not one that requires a huge amount of learning. Maybe once you've gotten the first 2 or 3 encounters, you get the idea. And then what happens after that is the experience of the engagement, you know, with the content and the interaction with your fellow player. You know, so I just have a couple of slides on the music. So, for example, actually just one slide. So there's a composition for each chapter. This is chapter 7, A Mad Tea Party. Do you remember this from the book? Alice comes to the garden and there's the Mad Hatter sitting there with the March hare and they're having this crazy conversation. You probably remember this wonderful scene, right? So basically, Svetlana composed music on Dali's painting. This is Dali's painting for the Mad Tea Party. You'll probably see here's a tree and there's a sort of a table that's melted, you know, like Dali's melting clocks. And the table itself is in fact a clock also. So and you can see there's a key and some other things going on. So this was Dali's painting. So Svetlana composed music on that painting. This is her specialty. She composes on art. She's a classically trained concert pianist. And I'm just going to play a little snippet from this. Okay, I think you get the idea. So we have different encounters. You can download. This is a free app, so you can download it and you can play it here in the campus if you like, and listen to the music if you want to hear all of it. Just go. Play again. So our hypothesis really was that using this game, Alice Dali AR, for intergenerational play would have beneficial effects on the cultural engagement and the interaction and the family bonding. So this was our hypothesis. So we staged in the Botanic Garden at Durham University, and we collected data over 2 days in 2024. And we've staged each of the 12 encounters in a chosen location in the garden that we felt resonated visually with the chapter material. So it looked nice, and we felt it was evocative of the story. And here's some examples. You see, this is, do you remember in the Alice book, The Pool of Tears? It's the second chapter. This is where Alice has grown so big and she's very distressed by her size that she's crying, but because she's so huge, her tears are enormous and she creates a flood, essentially. So that's the Pool of Tears. And this is Dali's painting, on that chapter, right? So you can sort of see the tears there at the top. So we placed this next to the pool that's in the Botanic Garden. So this resonated visually, but also in terms of material with the story. Here is the caterpillar. You probably remember also the caterpillar sitting on the giant mushroom and being spaced out. And it turned out that in the garden, they actually had a mushroom sculpture that you see here in the background. So this is, of course, the obvious place for us to put the caterpillar chapter. And you can see here Dali's illustration for the caterpillar. There's a mushroom in the foreground, and we have this giant, somewhat ominous-looking caterpillar in the background. So those are some examples, of those locations. Then we had 42 pairs of adult-child participants. So 84 participants in total, and they played the game on a shared smartphone. So they were only allowed to use one phone, but we gave them 2 sets of headphones such that they would hear the same audio at the same time in sync. And then we gave them instructions to show how to use the radar to find the first encounter, and then we sent them out on their way. essentially. So if you'd like to try the game, I forgot the postcards back at the hotel, but I actually have postcards for this that I was going to give you. But you can also just scan that QR code if you want to try it. As I said, it's a free game. We have some free games and some paid games. I'll talk more about that this afternoon. Why it's not working terribly well. And there's play instructions there also. So here's the results. So you can see our mean age, for the children, 7.8. For our carers, 43.5. And you see the gender split also. We had some children had experience playing outdoor AR games, Pokemon Go, really. We can see what the children and the adults enjoyed are different. So the children really enjoyed navigating by the radar. This idea of finding something hidden in the garden really enticed them. Whereas the adults, they enjoyed seeing the paintings and so on. The children also enjoyed seeing the paintings and navigating the radar. So that was switched for our adults and our children. We also saw helping the partner. So the most common helping behavior was that the children would help the parents understand the radar. The kids understood the radar immediately. It was like, as soon as we explained it, oh yeah, I get this. Out they go, right? Whereas the adults, for them, it was a little bit more challenging. So that was nice to see. I have a few more details on this. A lot of them didn't know that Salvador Dali had painted Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. I don't know how many of you knew that already. But 69% responded that they would like to see the original paintings, which we thought were interesting also because it showed elements of engaging with the art that we had used, because it's not, of course, seeing the original painting is nothing, it's much better than seeing a monophone. But so we take these results as evidence that the experience was educational in terms of art engagement, and also that it supported continuing cultural engagement by fostering interest in Dali's work. We had 62% reported that they liked the augmented reality game more than a typical walk in the garden. So we found this added to their walk in the garden, where 17% liked it about the same. So at least it didn't impact badly on them. So 69% said they would play the same game again in the same location, and 90% would play again with a different story, based on maybe on the second Alice book or something else. So the majority of partners helped one another, and often this occurred in relation to the radar, as I mentioned. Interestingly, this is, I think, really one of our main points here, is the adults felt significantly more connected to the child after playing. There's a test that we used, which is in the paper, that psychologists use to measure interconnectedness between people, and we saw that the adults felt much more connected to the child after than before the experience. Yes, so here's how much each pair talked about the different gain elements. So they talked about the art and music and about the story. So the music, they got sort of quite a lot of conversation between the pairs, but also the art and the story, as you can see there. We had some qualitative results. I'm not going to read these out, but you can just have a quick skim, essentially. So people said nice things. They thought it was engaging. They enjoyed it, and would do it again, and so on. The best hunt ever. Quote from a child. That's my favorite. Kind of getting here. So the qualitative comments show essentially that the game encouraged cultural engagement with art, literature, and music, as well as interaction and cooperation. So that's it. So that's an example of a very different serious game than the first one we had. Completely different objective, right? We didn't have specific learning objectives, but we had this vision of improving emotional bonding, and we had metrics to measure it, and then we created the game and ran the study. And now the game is there. As I mentioned, as a academic activity, this has been very worthwhile for us, but as a business activity, it doesn't carry a lot of weight because it's a free game. Anyone can play. We're not making any money, right? So, but that's fine, because we also consider it as sort of an artwork, a contribution to culture in its own right, especially with the original music. So that's kind of really what I had for today's session here. So the two case studies, and I hope the sort of foundation about serious games and interactive digital narrative was helpful also to try and frame the work and maybe also frame other work that you will encounter in the future. You'll find here our social media coordinates and websites and things like that, and my email. So feel free to reach out if you're interested. And I think we have time for questions, so if you have some questions, then I'm certainly very happy to take them. Yeah.
Yeah. So taking the story and the games that you were showing before, well, I come more from the film world and literature. So what I was wondering is, do you also map that or use typical narrative structures like three-act structure and stuff like that to kind of like also map out character development and that kind of stuff with those choices, and how does that work?
Yes, that is actually one of the challenges that I didn't have time to talk about today, but we will talk about at the workshop for where we're talking about interactive storytelling, because there are two structural considerations with interactive storytelling. One is the branching structure, as I show, and the choice. But what you're describing there is also very important, and that's essentially the narrative intensity. What is the three-act structure, like you mentioned? People in games often use Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, which is also a structure, a dramatic structure, essentially. And it's a real challenge, right, to get them to coexist, because I'm just going to sit back here to show you. Let's even just look at this one for a moment, right? How do we ensure that we have a nice sort of rising dramatic tension, and then we have a denouement at the end? If you follow sort of a Freitag's structure, how do we ensure this? It's a challenge. It's a real challenge. There is some interesting work on this. People have tried to create this dynamically using AI, not what we call generative AI today, but sort of old school computer science planners and so on, to create dramatic structures that are pleasing, regardless of what the player does. But it's not an easy problem to solve. So well done for spotting it. So yeah, I don't know if I really answered your question, but it's a very interesting conversation. We could spend more time on it.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Any more questions?
Thank you for the talk. I have a question do you have some experience with elder people? Because we are working with elder people in smart farming, and they are really interested in technology, but for us, it has been really difficult to reach these people. So I think that maybe through a serious game, it could be interesting, but do you have any experience with this population?
Only from this particular study. I mean, we've made some more games, that I'll talk about in some of the other talks we have scheduled here. But this is really the one where we had grandparents, as our oldest demographic. Otherwise, our games tended to be for younger audiences, either kids or like learners, probably in the 20s, 30s, maybe 40s. So we don't have a huge amount to share there. And in a sense, what we did with the Alice game was we dodged this challenge of having to show seniors how to play the game, because their grandchildren did it for us, right? Which is much better, right? Because grandparents are very patient with grandchildren, right? And they want to have that bond with them. So for us, that was easy, I think, compared to the challenges that you're facing in your project. I wish I had a better response for you, but I don't think I do, unfortunately. So maybe you can use grandchildren. I don't know if that's possible. They're great, yeah. So, okay.
So I have a question regarding the interaction. So everything that you talked to us was basically interactive narratives. And I was wondering, is there like a standard measure for interaction? So if you have an interactive narrative video game, how do you measure the level of interaction? Or is that something that you even care about? Or are there any studies on that?
Do you mean how much people interact, or?
Right, like how much people interact with the game, or in the case of the child-grandparent bonding, how do you measure their together interaction with the game? Like, whether there was an interaction among the players with the game. I don't know. That's kind of my question.
We asked them at the end, we asked them how many encounters they found, which would be sort of a secondary measure of interaction, because they do need to interact with the game to complete all the encounters. I don't think we had instrumentation in the game to measure exactly how much interaction there was, how much they looked at the paintings, how much they listened to the music. Those things can be hard to measure. We probably could have deduced how much people looked at the paintings before they took the photo, because taking the photo is kind of the end of the game loop. That's then you're on to the next encounter. We could have done that. We didn't do that. In terms of general, I mean, there are sort of frameworks that people use for measuring player experience, and some of these do touch on aspects of interactions. I don't know how helpful they are to understand interaction specifically. They probably are, but I don't have them handy just off the top of my head here. Also, they vary enormously. I mean, game mechanics are so different for different games. In our mechanics for, let me just hop back to this one here so you have it in front of you. Yeah, here, we have a navigation mechanic, right? So you navigate the physical space that you're in through the map, which I don't have here, unfortunately, but it's basically Google Maps with an overlay. And then here with the radar. So those are your navigation mechanics. This is how you interact with the game to find the encounters, right? So you navigate the site and you find the encounters. Then you have sort of the scan capture mechanic here, where you're looking around. I don't know if you noticed when we watched the video, there was a little yellow arrow that showed you which way to pan the phone. So it's not difficult, but you do get a hint there. And then after that, we have seen, when we've done studies on this, also other studies, that people do interact with the casebook also, and they sort of review their photos and they share their photos, with other people. So there's some sharing features for that also. So, but yeah. There's an interesting question, if I can answer your question in the context of interactive digital storytelling, because we saw these games here. Can go back here, like this one, like ours, and also Bandersnatch, and these other ones I showed you. This interaction is very overt, right? It's very clear what's going on. You have to choose, right? And you have to press the button. Nothing happens except in Bandersnatch if you take too long. But in our game, you have as long as you like to choose, right? So your interaction here is kind of blunt, I would say, right? It's a little bit crude, right? We are forcing the player to make a choice, and they only get these 3 choices. That's it, right? And there is interesting work on trying to hide these choices, or to make them sort of implicit in a way. And this is one of the things that I'm planning to talk about later on in one of the other talks, because there's some very interesting, highly experimental work that try to do this, to essentially make the interaction sort of invisible, or make you notice it less. Here you really notice it, right? It's very, very clear. It's user interface design to show it. But there's games where you don't see the interaction at all, right? It depends on how you play the game, right? But underneath, there's still the branching structure, right? So this is my point. So games can hide the choice if they want to, right? We're doing the opposite here. We're putting it smack in your face, right? And lots of people do that, like Bandersnatch, and some of the other games I showed you. But there's other ways to do it as well, and they can be very interesting. And there's many ways to hide the choice and make the interface sort of disappear, if you will. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I was wondering specifically on the narrative, how does one approach the branches? Like, what I mean is, do you plan all the branches with all the plot points and all the endings, or do you have certain plot points and certain endings and then work kind of backwards from there? What is...
I think I'm going to have to sort of give a little bit of an unfair answer to that, because it's up to you, right? Different writers. So we work with many writers, or not many writers, but we work with a few really good writers for interactive storytelling. And they have different ways of working. There are, and I didn't talk about structure, narrative structure today. You brought it up earlier also, and thank you for that. But there's a lot of different ways to structure a story, right? And I know I showed you this one a few times. I'm just going to hop back to it again now. This one, right? So do you start at the end or do you start at the beginning when you're writing it, right? And I think it's really up to you. I think in most cases, it's an iterative process. You probably know where the story is going to go. You have some ideas for, what can the player do? And how much control do we want to give the player, right, over the story, right? This story here, and if you looked at the book also, gives the player a huge amount of control, right? Crazy things can happen here. We saw them, right? You know, we can break the arm, right? We end up in hell, right? And Jane disappears, the cat disappears, the cock disappears, the ghost is freed, right? It's mind-blowing what can happen in the story, right? And writing this kind of story in a way that will give the player a good sort of narrative experience is hard, right? Coming back to your point about the 3-act structure. I don't think there's a 3-act structure in this story, and I don't think they were trying to do that, right? But if you wanted to do a nice 3-act structure, you have to be really strict about your process, and you have to say, okay, I need at some point here in my graph, I need something to happen that gives me, you know, some sort of satisfying climax, you know, in the story, right? I need to put that in there. And with this type of very broad structure, that's really hard, right? So in one of the other talks, we'll talk more about other structures. This is, as I mentioned, this one is called the time cave structure because it was first, or one of the early stories that used it was called the time cave. But there's also much more narrow structures, like the Bandersnatch structure, right? So the Bandersnatch structure here, I think, is what is called a gauntlet structure, you know, so basically, you're running down a gauntlet here in a minute, and you can make choices, but they normally come back pretty quickly to the main track, or they kick you back and you fail and you have to start over somewhere. So very different structure. And with a structure like a gauntlet, it's much easier to stay in control of the narrative tension, right? Because you can say, okay, no matter what the player does, we know at this point here, all players are going to make it here to this point. So we can make this an important event in the story. This can be our narrative climax if we want to, because we know all players will see it, right? Whereas with the other structure, who knows where the player is going to end up, right? So, which is also fun, but very challenging. So I think in practice, to come back to your question, I think in practice, it's really a question of knowing where the story wants to go, or where you want the story to go, and then iterate and experiment, you know, see how does the story feel when you're playing it. We'll do this in the workshop. We'll use Twine to create some interactive stories, and we'll show you how to do it, and some narrative structures you might want to use. I'd encourage you to come to that for sure. But the challenges are really to iterate, you know, to play test really, which is, well, of course, what we do with games anyway. So yeah. Did I answer your question? Oh, thank you. Okay, great.
¿Alguna pregunta más?
Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming.